evening. I'm on my Pat Malone tonight for Dashing Down Sporting Adventures podcast view from the outer. It's not really view from the outer, it's more view from Dan. But nice to be here in what's been an incredible round of footy, round 23. And it's part of Dashing Down Sporting Adventures podcast. You can get on all social media outlets, including Spotify. And they go to Sportho as well. It's a bar in Yarraville. Dine in, take away, group bookings, functions and catering. Come join our family. The best way to enjoy the Sportho, which is the best Italian food ever. Take it from me. And also tell them Dan sent you. The best way to enjoy the Sportho is together. Great pizzas, great pasta, magnificent homemade bread, wonderful gelatis, wonderful sweets, magnificent. And also some beautiful drinks from Italy as well. So do yourself a favour, in the words of Ian Molly Meldrum, get down to the Sportho family restaurants based in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And as far as Essendon's concerned, near Windy Hill, the home of the Bombers, for many, many years. And they probably should have stayed there. But of course, there was a dispute between the football club and the bowling club. It's now been decided or now been resolved. And the women are going to set up a brand new facility at Windy Hill, which is good for them. The men moving out to the pretty sterile environment, as far as I'm concerned, in my humble opinion. A lot of other people have said that too, out at the hangar at Airport West. And it certainly hasn't helped their form this year, the Bombers. Lots going on in the world of footy. Before we look at what was a fascinating round, 2 draws in a round. Some were saying since 1977. I did check that today. And I was actually at the game between the Bulldogs and St Kilda as an 8-year-old, day before my first communion, being a nice little Catholic boy from the northeastern suburbs of Melbourne and Eaglemont. St Kilda played the Bulldogs. Saints finished bottom that year, and Footscray were a middle-of-the-road side. Games at the Whitten Oval, or the Western Oval as it was in those days. And the Dogs started well. The Saints finished much better. Probably the best game I saw Russell Green playing St Kilda colours. He then, of course, moved on to Hawthorn. Very famous story that in those days, and it was 3 years later, 1980, you could often be cleared mid-season. And on a Thursday night, before the Hawks were to play North Melbourne, and the Saints, I think, were playing Footscray by memory, and they hadn't won a game yet. Footscray under new coach Royce Harder was seen as the messiah, but unfortunately for Royce, like a lot of great players, wasn't quite good enough as a coach. I think he probably thought, and nothing against him, that everyone needed to be like him, but not everyone is. In fact, not many were. But anyway, the Saints were playing Footscray, and on Thursday night, Russell Green, thinking he'd be in the St Kilda side, was told that he'd be playing for Hawthorn, and he turned up on the Saturday at Waverley, and he place. He said, no, I've actually been cleared to the Hawks, and it was probably the best thing that happened to him. He'd been a spasmodic performer at the Saints. Mind you, that day when they drew in 1977, he was magnificent in the second half, and he's gone to Hawthorn. With the greatest respect to St Kilda, a more professional club, and it was the goal era, playing in 6 consecutive grand finals between 83 and 88, won the best and fairest in 1984 and played in 3 premierships. So that was a draw in round 7 of 1977. And as I say, I think everyone thought that there was also a draw between Richmond and Essendon on the same day. 2 weeks later at Waverley, they played a draw in what was a very good game of football as well. But as far as I can remember, in all the years I've been following footy, and it's been since 1975, this is the first round we've had 2 draws. Hawthorn and Collingwood on Saturday, and eerily familiar to their draw back in round 9. It was 93 points apiece that night, 92 points apiece on Saturday night, and you wouldn't read about it. Dylan Moore had the last shot for the Hawks right on the siren in round 9, and he managed to kick it behind to level the scores. A goal would have won them the game. In this match, he had a kick again. He might have rushed it slightly. There's been some talk today with Gerard Whateley on his program, Whateley with Adam Simpson, on their means test segment as part of the AFL review, that maybe it's something the AFL could bring in, and that is put the clock as to how much time is left, like you see on the television up on the big screen so the player knows. Now, Dylan Moore was a fair way out on the boundary on the Great Southern Stand side of the ground, heading towards the western end. And his kick looked good off the boot, but it just dropped a bit short. Would have gone through if young Swaddling of Collingwood hadn't have whacked it back into play right on the line. So we get a draw in that game. I had the shot to win the game for the Hawks on both occasions, and he wasn't able to do it. But those two sides, I've never seen it, the same two teams draw in the same season in two matches. And incredible that Collingwood managed to get the draw. They started well against the Hawks. They've been a bit patchy. Worry a little bit about their tall forwards. We know the small forwards are good. Watson, Ginnivan, Moore. But Charles struggling a bit. Lewis a little bit up and down. We know Gunston's a good player, though, coming towards the back end of what's been a stellar career. But who knows when that career is going to end. So many players going on a lot longer than they used to because of the fact there's 5 on the bench. And players are managed much differently nowadays than they were when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s and into the 1990s. Although in those days, there started to be more on the bench, of course, in the 1970s. Once you're off, you're off. As far as the reserves were concerned, the 19th and 20th men, a bit like in soccer, once you're off when the subs come in. And I know there are a lot of ex-players that their attitude is that you just keep playing. Even if you get tired, you're playing. That's what the game's all about, but it's so much different nowadays. But, it was an incredible game of footy, and the Magpies found a way to get back in the game on a few occasions after being 22 up at halftime. The Hawks looked the better team halfway through the third, and Collingwood got going again through the brilliant Nick Dacos. Talked about their kids. Swaddling looks a good player. Hayes, solid. Rowan Steele, who I first saw when I was broadcasting in the Mornington Peninsula Football Netball League. He made his debut as a forward pocket. He was solid at best, with the greatest respect, with Frankston YCW. But then he went to Casey and got better, and now he's at Collingwood and's got even better than that. I just think he's one of those players at the higher the level, the better the player he is, and he's been good. And Ed Allen, after quite a few years on the list, the son of former Hawthorn premiership player and best and fairest winner in the same year, Ben Allen also played some good footy at Fremantle before his knees gave in. And Ed Allen's starting to find some good form as well. Charlie West, another one. And he aptly named Puncher. So they've got some good kids, and there had been some criticism about the Pies over the last year or so, even though I think Craig McRae's a genius of a coach with the system they have in place. Like a lot of other teams, once someone goes out, no matter who that player is, and someone else is expected to come in again, if they're very inexperienced, replacing an experienced, they have to be able to perform at the highest level. And that's what the Magpies have been able to do. And these young players that they're starting to blood look the goods. And they've got the Magpies certainly into a wildcard position. When I say host, they'll play the Carlton or the Bulldogs. So they're not really hosting, are they? It just means that they have their name first in regard to that wildcard final. And if it's Carlton, it'll be fantastic. It'll just indicate that the wildcard's been successful in regard to the matchups, because it'll be a massive crowd. And it could be the Blues. The Blues, incredibly, have found a way to make the playoffs, or the wild card, as they call it. I might as well say playoffs, because of the fact that Australian rules football and the AFL are using an American term, the wild card, which is used, of course, in the NFL. And they've brought in the wild card this year, which has been criticised a bit, but we are going to have teams with at least the same number of wins as losses. Carlton have got Fremantle this week. They're on 11, 10 and 1, and they've had 10 wins, 2 losses and a draw since Josh Fraser took over, and he is going to be, as I record this tonight, tomorrow, Tuesday, going to be appointed the permanent coach of the Carlton Football Club after deciding last week, after he had buried his father. It'd been a sad time for him and his family, losing his father, and he had kept his nose clean in regard to saying too much about whether he wanted the job. Maybe deep down he did, but he had, well, as he kept saying, it's process-driven, just trying to make the club better, and he's certainly done that. I don't think any of us thought. I had Rob Cross, who's a very passionate and positive Carlton supporter, on the show. I think the night before Michael Voss got sacked, And he actually said, I'm a positive Carlton supporter, Dan, as you know, the Blues can maybe win 11 of their last 14 and get in. Well, they're going to do that. To say, lost 2 and drawn 1 and they're in, which is an incredible performance. They needed a draw at least against the Bulldogs yesterday. I thought they were going to win comfortably against the Dogs, who had a lot of injuries, and they were resting Marcus Bontempelli, which was the right thing to do, even though he's so important to the team. I don't think any club relies more on their best players than the Bulldogs do, but he's had a bit of a sore Achilles, so they gave him a rest. And the Dogs played some pretty good footy and might have got over the line. There was a goal, of course, that was given to them when Jordan Croft, I should say, had thrown the football. So a couple of things went their way. Ed Richards was called for going too far, and I think he did, but there was nothing on offer inside the 50. So they made a few blues. They missed some shots as well, the Dogs, but it was a good effort from them considering how poorly they played against the improving Kangaroos the previous week. And I thought Carlton were red hot against the Saints, even better, I think, producing the best performance of anyone this season in the way that they were able to dispose of Brisbane, who've been pretty good after a sluggish start to the season. Only had one loss. It was a big one. But as is Chris Fagan's want, he seemed to put it behind him, and the players have put it behind them to concentrate on making sure they finish top 4. But that was a great win by the Blues against Brisbane 2 weeks ago, as we discussed on View from the Outer, thanks to the Sporto family restaurants, where Italy comes alive on a plate. Dan Lonergan with you tonight, flying solo. And we'll hopefully have some guests on next week as we talk about the lead up to the wildcard round and also summarise the teams that have missed out. One of those teams is St Kilda, and a passionate St Kilda fan has been on the show a lot this year, Darren Parkin. A shout out to him and his wife, Lisa. They've become parents again. Their second daughter, Amelia, is, 2.5? And she now has a little sister, Aria, who was born on the weekend. So well done, Parker. The Saints had a good win too. We had Mark Fine on the program last week. We know how much he loves the Saints. And Finey actually didn't want the Saints to make the playoff. At one stage, it looked like they were still going to be alive going into the final round this week on Thursday night against Gold Coast. That match is now, unfortunately, going to be a dead rubber on the Thursday night. But if the Dogs had have hung on, they would have been inside the top 10 with a better percentage than Carlton, and the Blues have Fremantle this week. Could have, should have, would have. It's not going to happen, but there can still be a lot of changes inside the top 10. But as the Saints look at their season, I think they need to consider it a failure. I know a lot of their supporters are trying to protect them, saying that not a lot was expected this year, but why not? They picked up DeConning, who they thought was going to be the saviour on big money. To me, way too much money. Silvani's been very good, probably played his best season of senior footy because he's managed to get continuity into his football. He used to be injured way too much at Carlton. Flanders started well and then got injured. And Liam Ryan's had his moments, as Liam Ryan always does, a premiership player at the West Coast Eagles back in 2018. Their kids are where they need to concentrate. Boxall's improved a lot this year. The one that has really improved is Garcia. He's been absolutely sensational. They picked up Max Hall, who's been a great pickup and was superb again on Saturday in their big win over the disappointing Tigers, which was very, very poor from them. We'll get to them very shortly. And Brad Hill, what a great player he's been. 300 games, hasn't that crept up? Of course, starting at the Hawks, playing in 3 premierships in a row early in his career, then went to Fremantle, and then his family wanted to return to Melbourne, and he was taken by the Saints and has played great footy. And he showed how good he was on the weekend with no Nasiah Wanganeen-Millera and dominating that game as he gets ready for his 300th game, the last game of the season this week. So it really is a case of what might have been for the Saints. Mitch Almond's kicked 5 goals. I thought this game was banana peel for them, considering the injuries that they had, especially Nasiah Wanganeen-Millera, who'll forget all the drama associated with him doing his hamstring. He'd had 4 possessions in the first 6 minutes against the Blues last Sunday night. And, of course, SEN very big on promoting clubs with Blues radio and Saints radio. They've got Cats radio. They've had a bit of Hawks radio and there's Saints radio and Blues radio on at the same time. And you can see those pictures on the social media platforms, especially Facebook, of John Donahoe calling the Saints radio, being a mad keen Saints fan. Mark Fine was with him, and former star St Kilda player Ozzie Jones and Donna's was talking like the season was over, like there'd been a death in the family with Naz going down early in that first quarter. The Carlton boys of Ant Christou, Anthony Koutafidis and Sam Edmonds, no Andy Marr. They were fairly churlish about Naz being injured. But I think it's been a great innovation. Those clubs just having their own teams. When I say their own teams broadcast, they're broadcasting the other side as well, but predominantly barracking for their team. And it just showed how devastating it was for St Kilda last week to lose Naz. But full credit to them. I'm not the greatest fan of Ross Lyon. He's very good at being able to deflect in the media. I think he's treated the media very poorly at times this year. And I'd love your comments on our column to do with this particular. I'll start that again. This is Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures podcast, and it's View from the Outer. I'm on my own tonight. We're having a look at round 23 of the AFL season. A lot going on. A big story, of course, off the field. We'll get to that shortly, but we're just talking about the Saints. And I'd love your comments too on our various social media pages about what we're talking about tonight and talking about St Kilda at the moment. And I get very disappointed and very frustrated with Ross Lyon because I think he deflects way too much to the media. I think he treats them abysmally, abhorrently, and almost like they are second-class citizens at times. That's just my opinion, my view. And I think that he could be a lot better. I think he realises that this has been a season that's got away for the Saints, having missed out, of course, on the Wildcard. And I think there is pressure mounting because they went out and spent. I think they spent on the wrong players. I think they need to concentrate more on their youth, as I touched on earlier. They've got some good young players coming through. I love Wilson, who's re-signed for the Saints, which was important for them. Philippou's been a bit disappointing. I think that they need to get his attitude right, Matthias Philippou. We know what a great player Cal Wilkie is. I think late in the season has shown that the pressure has got a bit too much for him. He's off his tucker slightly. The Bulldogs were very keen on him and got pretty close last season. They felt he was the missing piece in the puzzle down back. There's a lot more issues with that football club than just that. But he would have been handy for the Bulldogs. But again, played some very good footy for the Saints, especially in the first 2/3 of the season. He sort of, as I say, has lost his way in the back end. But he's been another positive for them. But they'll be disappointed, St Kilda, because Andrew Bassett, their president, had said all along that they were sick and tired of sort of being treated like a second-class citizen by the other clubs. That was his view, his words and his view, and he's entitled to having those words and those views. I'm entirely sure they're right. But as I say, it's an opinion-based industry. So they've gone out and got these players, but I'm still not convinced they're the right sort of players that the Saints need. They'll have another look, obviously, in the off-season, but they're still a fair way off at St Kilda, and they'd be pretty disappointed with their season. So they did have a good win over Richmond, who should be embarrassed by what they dished up on the weekend. I know Adam Uze has said that. It's not working with him as coach at the moment. Look, I know that there's a caveat there with the injuries. They got all those early draft picks a couple of years ago, 7 picks inside 30. The unfortunate aspect of that is many of them have played less than the allotted number of games that have been played over the last 2 years. So we're talking of 46 games. Not many of them would have played 20. Lawler's been good, but he's had injuries. Houghton has shown a bit in the back end of both seasons, but injuries in the front end. We haven't seen Josh Smiley, who was their second pick at pick 7. I saw him as a junior a few years ago playing for the Yarra Junior Football League, and I thought, gee, this boy's just head and shoulders above everyone else, under 15, under 16. Maybe he didn't grow enough after that. Maybe he hasn't grown into his body as well with all the calf injuries he's had, and he hasn't even played any VFL footy either. He's been on the sidelines for 2 years. And the tall forwards, Armstrong and also Fall and Sims have had injuries. Trainer's played a bit of footy. He's been okay. And their picks in last year's draft have shown a little bit as well, Cumming and Grilge. But they just haven't quite produced the form or the output that the Tigers were looking for. You can't help injuries, certainly impact injuries like knees, and Sims is one of those players that suffered from that. But they should have been better for 2 of their heroes, premiership heroes, triple premiership players in Dion Prestia, played his last game for the club on the weekend. He's had a lot of injuries in recent times as well. And Nathan Broad, who in 2017, some would say was just a bits and pieces player, a role player at best, but did what he had to do, limited in his football ability, but he certainly got better and better. And good enough to play in 3 premierships for the Tigers. He's retired as well. We may still see them playing AFL footy next year, even though Presti has had all these hamstring injuries. He hasn't given up of maybe continuing his career elsewhere, maybe an on-field, unofficial coaching role, and they get 12 to 15 games out of him if his body stands up. There has been talk about Broad, who's returning back to WA with his family, where he's originally from, maybe teaming up with Andrew McWalter, who has got a good relationship with a lot of those Richmond players who he was an assistant coach with under Damien Hardwick. And then, of course, he took over when Hardwick surprised everyone by standing down halfway through the 2023 season, when things started to fall away for Richmond, a bit like what's happened to his team in his second year in charge, the Gold Coast Suns. So the Tigers have got some work to do. And as I say, I'm still concerned about Adam Uze's tenure. I'm not convinced that he is the right man for the job. But then again, we keep saying the caveat, they keep having injuries. But even when they've tried to play a brand of football with the list they've got, they've still got some experienced players. It's been pretty hard to identify what that brand of football is. And you'd think you'd start the season next year, but if they're 9-5 and getting well beaten, as they have in quite a few matches this year and been virtually non-competitive like they were on the weekend, you'd have to start thinking that the club will be looking elsewhere, and that would be tough for Uze, who came to Richmond with a reasonable reputation. He was recruited to Melbourne, a club where he played so much great football after spending some time at Hawthorn as an opposition analyst, being pretty close to Alistair Clarkson, having played footy with Clarko at the Demons early in his career in the late 1990s. And then he went to Melbourne, and he was seen as one of the major architects in the Demons winning the flag. He didn't see much of him. He was mainly in the box. Simon Goodwin was down on the boundary with Mark Williams in the premiership year of 2021. And Uze was in the box, apparently leading the situation up there. And he's been credited with playing a big part in them winning that premiership with the game plan that was introduced. But as I say, we have not seen any discernible evidence, as far as I'm concerned, of a game plan being in place with Richmond at the moment. And it was a very poor performance for two of their retiring stars, and also for Tom Lynch, who was playing game 250 in what's been an injury-riddled career since he started at the Gold Coast and then came to the Tigers. So they'd be hoping they can be more competitive against the Cats, but good luck, because as we're all aware, the top 10 might be settled, but the places inside the top 10 still very much up for grabs. And the Cats, if they can have a big win and maybe results go their way, they could sneak into top 4, but they'll need to have a big win. Hawthorn have got West Coast. You think they'd win? The Eagles have dropped a number of games in a row in the second half of the season under Andrew McWalter. I still think they've improved West Coast, and they've got some good young kids who've played a fair bit of footy, unlike Richmond, like Shanahan. We know that Harley Reid's a good player. Willem Dersma has certainly showed plenty in his first season of senior footy. Hoff's getting better and better, the amount of football he plays. Bazzo down back. So they've got the nucleus of a good side, but they've got to start winning matches. And they've picked up some experienced campaigners in recent times in Brandon Starcevich, the dual premiership player at the Lions, and, of course, some players from Richmond that we've spoken about. Andrew McWalter having a good relationship with a number of Richmond players when he was assistant coach there, such as Jack Graham, and he's a very, very important piece of the puzzle for West Coast, and also Liam Baker. But they're not winning enough games. There are a couple of games they probably should have won, and they haven't been able to get over the line in recent weeks, and they'd be disappointed about that. The Richmond game was one that they should have won. They were, I think, the better side on paper, but games aren't played on paper, and that will stick in their craw a bit. So I think they've improved West Coast, but I'm not sure how much. And they play Hawthorn, who, to me, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit up and down. They're playing some good footy, but not great footy. They've been a bit unimpressive in some of their wins. They've also shown some lack of discipline. I thought James Sicily in his 200th game on the weekend was very, very disappointing. He gave away a lot of free kicks. He didn't seem to have his eye on the game enough, or his mind in the game, if you know what I mean. And they've got a bit of work to do, the Hawks. So they need to win to ensure they finish top 4. Geelong are looking for a big win over Richmond. We know there's been a few issues at the Cats in the last 24 hours or so, involving, of course, Jake Kolodjasny and the waiver on the concussion. And I still think there's a fair bit to play out with that. But in regard to situations on the field, the Cats did enough against North in a high-scoring game. The concern might be that they have an ability to concede a lot of goals in a short space of time. I mean, North, coming off a good win over the Bulldogs, were magnificent in the opening quarter on the weekend. They blew the Cats away 7-1. And I thought, gee, they're a massive chance here, North Melbourne, to indicate they'll end the season on a good note. They've got the Swans this week, and we'll get to them shortly because there's been a lot going on off the field with the Sydney Swans, and who knows who'll be playing for them this week. We can't say a great deal about it, but we'll get to it shortly. And they're in great shape on the ladder, second on the table, Sydney, but there's, of course, a big issue brewing, a controversial issue brewing off the field. If you haven't caught up with that, I'll get to that very shortly on Dashing Down Sporting Adventures, View from the Outer podcasts on my Pat Malone tonight. Great to be with you. And we're here for the Sporto Family Restaurants, where Italy comes alive on a plate. And they have a number of restaurants in Williamstown, Yarraville and Essendon, right near the Windy Hill football ground, the home for many years of the mighty Bombers, the kiosk at Williamstown Beach, Gelato de Sporto in Yarraville, and Bottega de Sporto, a bar in Yarraville. But North Melbourne were really good against Geelong, and they kicked 7-1 in the first quarter. The Cats, though, showing what they can do. They can score heavily very quickly. They kicked 9-2. They're in front at half-time. North back in front by a point at three-quarter time, and you thought there was still a massive chance here. But Geelong, with a little bit more class, more evenness across the ground, they had 11 goal kickers. They were able to find a way to get over the line. But North still a pretty good performance, and I'm going to give a shout-out to Jack Darling. I thought, like a number of people, that North were taking a massive risk when West Coast didn't play him late in the season in 2024, and he was stuck on 298 games. One thing about Jack Darling is he's been durable. He hasn't missed a lot of games through injury. North took a punt on him, and he's actually been really good, and I think he'll go on again next year, and why not? Because he continues to play most games, and he's a very good fall for Nick Larkey, whose form has not been so good in the second half of the year. But Darling has stood up, and the recruitment of him, Luke Parker, another very durable player, and even Caleb Daniel. He was out of favour at the Dogs in 2024. I still think that he had a role to play, and still think he has a role to play at the Western Bulldogs, and he's been pretty good for North as well. So say those three players have managed to play most games, which has certainly helped them. We know they've had some performances that have let them down. They haven't beaten too many of the better sides. They did beat the Bulldogs, but again, I'm not convinced how good they are, despite their good performance against Carlton on the weekend. They were very good in that game. We know how good that midfield is. I mean, George Wardlaw is the one that sets the example. He's as hard as a cat's head. He came back last week. He was very good. Again, pretty good against the Cats as well. Harry Sheasel suffered a broken jaw, so he's gone for the last game of the year, but he's been magnificent. He gets better and better each week. O'Sullivan's been good. McKerch is good as well. Davies Uniacke. So I think their midfield is certainly blessed with lots of talent. The forward line, we mentioned Darling. Paul Curtis is a very good small forward. Nick Larkey just needs to be a little bit more consistent. The back line, though, needs a big body. They've been talking about Jacob Wiedering, but I'm not sure that will happen, with the Blues maybe on the verge of something special next year. Although I think North are good enough, and they need to be good enough next year in Alistair Clarkson's last year in this current contract to at least make the wild card, if not go higher than that. They've won, 9 games so far this year? As I say, Sydney on the weekend could give them 10. That'd be a pass mark. But there's still been some games this year where you thought they're good enough to win those games now. They're beating the teams below them, the teams that they've been with in recent years in Richmond, and especially Essendon and West Coast, where they've been murdered at the bottom of the ladder with those two sides in particular. So they're winning those, and they got a sort of scalp beating the Bulldogs. Look, they were the team that started the rot for the Gold Coast, who won 7 from 10 and were leading by big margins, and North stormed home. We thought, here we go, but that was a bit of a false dawn, because a few weeks later, Fremantle made mincemeat of them in one of those 2 games that they sold to WA, which, again, I'm not sure was the right way to go. But anyway, they did it, but it just indicated what a good side Fremantle is and how far North have to go. But I think their second half of the season has been quite good. Love to get your views on our Facebook and social media pages as well. And, of course, we're here for Dashing Down Sporting Adventures View from the Outer, having a look at round 20. They seem to be, depending on who you're talking to, the favourites now for Zach Butters. I'm going to ask how, but obviously they seem to have maybe found a way of enticing him. The word at Geelong, and from people that know the Cats better than me and are on the beat all the time in the media, is that they tend to offer players that they entice to their club a little less than maybe other clubs would. Richmond are offering huge money to Zach Butters, massive money, obscene money almost, but he's a very good player. So maybe it's not obscene, but they're very keen to get him, even though they're going through this massive rebuild at the moment and may not have bottomed out yet, the Tigers. We spoke about them earlier, but Richmond are very keen on him. You know, the Bulldogs are keen on him, and I wonder if they've sort of not done enough to push it, thinking that because he is a Western Bulldog supporter, he wants to go back and live where he grew up at Bacchus Marsh in Darley, and the trip to the Western Oval is a bit closer than most other places, although the trip to Geelong isn't too bad either. It'd be almost the same, not knowing my geography 100%, but it appears at this stage, depending on who you're talking to, of course, that the Cats might be leading the race for Zach Butters, and there'll be a lot of annoyed football supporters out there, except Geelong supporters, of course, saying, how are they going to get him? They're also keen on Toby Green. I'm hearing, even though his wife is going to be playing netball interstate, that maybe Tim English, even though he's got a contract at the Dogs, might be looking to get out. There seems to have been a bit of a souring in the relationship. It's a bit tense now between him and Luke Beveridge, but that's the way Beveridge operates. He tends to lose his players after saying that he has great care for his players until he doesn't. But that might be one to watch closely, that Geelong need a ruckman, although they've got by without one, haven't they? Young Mitch Edwards is developing nicely. Blitzarves is one of the more flexible players in the competition, can play in a number of different positions. He's been in the ruck and doing a pretty good job and getting support from Edwards. But the Cats are putting themselves in a position where they can have another crack at it and finish in the top six, get a week off and get ready to go again and try and see if they can win another flag. If they do, it'd be a mighty performance from this football club. But having said that, it's still going to be interesting what happens with the Jake Kolodjasny case and the wavering of responsibility for any more concussions that he has. Some people say it's a bit of a storm in a teacup. Kane Corns is certainly one of those, but I think it's a lot worse than that. And the fact that Craig Drummond was president at the time that this particular waiver occurred, that the document was signed back in 2024, and is now the chairman of the AFL Commission, I think that some heads need to roll. Maybe his head is one. Stephen Hocking, the CEO of Geelong, has said the responsibility is with him. We haven't heard what the end result is regarding that investigation or whether there's going to be a fully blown investigation, but we'll have to keep a close eye on that. But Geelong are very good at being able to compartmentalise. In my time in football, especially during this golden era of the last 20 years or so, where they've concentrated on what's happening on the field, and off the field, those issues have not affected their success on the field, hence why they've made the finals virtually every year since 2004. They've been a very, very successful club, as we know. 4 flags, 6 grand finals appearances, numerous preliminary finals appearances, and of course there was a knock on Chris Scott saying his finals record wasn't great. They'd lose the qualifying final, they'd win the semi-final and lose the preliminary final, because losing the qualifying final, even if they'd finished second and had that home final, meant that they were disadvantaged maybe playing interstate in a qualifying final. They also lost one to Hawthorn at the MCG narrowly. The Hawks went on to win the flag, of course, in 2013. So there was some criticism of Chris Scott, but I think he's righted that criticism in recent years, of course, winning a premiership and getting them into a grand final and constantly ensuring that the list doesn't need to be rebuilt, just bringing players in and rebuilding on the run, if you like, with players from other clubs, because they've been able to sell the lifestyle and maybe not the expensive wages or the big wages that other clubs have been trying to do to entice players to their club, like St Kilda, like Richmond are with Butters. Not sure what the Bulldogs have offered at this stage, but they're certainly very keen to get him. If they don't get him, there's talk that maybe Matt Rowell, though he's still got a year to go on his contract at the Gold Coast. Let's get to Sydney now and Dashing Down Sporting Adventures. Our View from the Outer podcast, you can get on all social media platforms and also on Spotify for Desporto Family Restaurants. Magnificent Italian food. All the ingredients come from Italy. Some restaurants feed you, we bring you home. Though at Desporto, every dish at Desporto is a love letter to southern Italy, artisan crafted from the freshest seasonal produce, built on recipes passed down through generations and served with the warmth of family around a shared table. For those that haven't caught up, the big footy story, and today it should have been about the brilliance of the game, the beauty of the game on the weekend with those two draws, but it's been about the Sydney Swans, who have probably had the best culture of any club since Paul Roos took over in 2002. They're a club that when players have gone to them from other clubs, and they've had many that have done it over, most of them have become better players when they've joined the Sydney Swans in Sydney. I like the fact that the AFL is not of a high profile in Sydney, and they like the fact that they can just go on and do their football, and outside playing football and training, they can sort of live their own life, unlike in the fishbowl of AFL football here in Melbourne and in Adelaide and also in Perth and soon to be in Hobart with the introduction of the Tassie Devils in 2028. They've done everything right on the field, making the finals like Geelong regularly. The only issue has been the big losses in grand finals, bar 2016, which was a tight game. They were, though, a bit beaten up when they took on the Dogs, and that was shown in the last quarter where the Dogs were running on top of the ground and got over the line. What a big day that was, a special day that was for their first flag since 1954. Those other grand finals they've lost after winning in 2012 when Hawthorn were the favourites were, of course, 2014 where the Hawks blew them away, and then they suffered a big loss to the Cats in 2022. They were very ordinary that day. And they were also well beaten in 2024 by the Brisbane Lions, who'd mounted a magnificent finals campaign. And Sydney were poor. And last year, they started slowly under new coach Dean Cox. They finished the season okay, missed the finals in 10th position, 12 wins, 11 losses. And under Cox this year, he's managed to get them going. Their record against some of the better sides has not been great, but they've still won enough matches to be right in contention. 2 games clear in second, so they were going to get at least 2 finals at the SCG where they have a great record. Of course, the uniqueness of that ground being small certainly favours a team like the Sydney Swans because, of course, the other venues are much bigger than the Swans, and when they go up and play the Swans, who, of course, play there every second week, it's been much harder for them to adjust, unlike Sydney. So that's the advantage they have. The grand finals, a different kettle of fish at the MCG, but they've just been really disappointing, especially in the last 2, and they were hoping to right the wrongs. But unfortunately for Sydney, there's been an incident off the field. Now, they beat Essendon last night, the last game of round 23. They virtually put the game to bed in the first quarter against the Bombers. Full credit to Essendon. They battled manfully in the second half and also after quarter time to basically ensure that the margin didn't get out more than 6 goals. In fact, they got it to 4 goals at one stage. Sydney, though, I wonder if they put the foot on the brake a little bit and they sort of cruised to the line, won quite comfortably. There's some good signs from Essendon, certainly some good signs from Sydney, especially Errol Gordon, who's had an incredible 47 possessions, and they missed him in the first half of the year, like last year. He missed, I think, 2/3 of the season last year. Bad injuries, but since he's come back, he has played magnificent footy and it's just got better and better. And 47 possessions, he had the footy on a string. I think at one stage he had to go to the toilet and the footy followed him down there. That's how often he had it on the weekend. Thanks for laughing, everyone. Very poor attempt at humour. Warner's been good. We know Heaney's having a fantastic season. Curnow kicked 4 goals again, but it was an interesting decision made by the club that they didn't go back. We know there's a curfew at Sydney Airport, and the game ended, about 7:30. So I'm not sure what time the last plane is that's allowed into Sydney Airport. I know a few weeks ago I was up in Brisbane for a cricket tournament, and I caught a plane from Brisbane Airport at 20 to 10 that got me into Melbourne at 11:45. So there was no curfew in Brisbane about how late the planes can be. So maybe that was the issue. So they were staying overnight at the Pullman across the road from the MCG. And some of the players have gone out. It was a strange decision. If you want to have a quiet drink, maybe have a couple in the bar at the Pullman. Because, as I say, they've got a big month coming up, Sydney, an opportunity again to be in the big dance, to try and right the wrongs of what's happened in recent years. And the information we have at this stage, and there's not a lot of information, the Swans released a statement this morning, and then their CEO, the former Fremantle champion Matthew Pavlich, virtually gave the same statement at a very brief press conference. was just a statement. Someone asked a question. He gave an answer. It really didn't say much. He said it's now a police matter. But what's happened is they've gone out to a pub in Wellington Parade in Fitzroy near the very famous St Vincent's Hospital. We don't know what that pub is. We don't know who the players were as well. What we have heard is that they are high-profile players and among the better players involved at the Swans. And that would be very disappointing, especially if they're leaders. They should know better. Other players obviously weren't there and be thinking, what are you doing? And there appears to have been a situation occur. There's been allegations made by some women who actually turned up at the hotel where the Swans are staying and confronted the coach, Dean Cox, with their complaints, these women, that there had been some impropriety or some situation that has got out of control. And as I say, allegations at this stage. And some women have complained to the Sydney Swans regarding allegations of sexual assault. As I say, allegations at this stage. And we don't know any more. It's with the police. So the question needs to be asked, what happens now? You would think these players will be stood down from the last home and away game against North Melbourne. They can't miss out on second spot. They might have rested a few of them anyway, as a few clubs are likely to do this week, knowing, except, of course, the clubs that are playing their last game, they want to go out with a bang. But the rest of them who are all in the top 10 may rest some players, although there are some clubs that are still hoping to finish as high as they can, like Hawthorn, trying to cement top four, as we mentioned earlier. Melbourne have had an outstanding season, still an outside chance for top four, but certainly to finalise top six. They take on the Bulldogs. Adelaide missed an opportunity against Freo, played some great footy on the weekend. They mightn't rest too many because they're trying to avoid playing in the Wildcard. Bulldogs can't go any further than 8th. That's the highest they can finish, which means they'll play Collingwood. So no home ground advantage there. They'll be trying to avoid 10th, though. Means they could have to travel to Adelaide, and the Blues are the same as well when they take on the Dockers, who can't go anywhere either. And they've been resting one player a week over the last 3 or 4 weeks. So Sydney might have rested a few players anyway, but they may have to admit players depending on this particular situation. We saw Geelong player Tanner Bruin be accused of a similar situation last year, or the year before, I should say, and he missed all of last season as that particular matter continued on throughout 2024. He was eventually cleared of no wrongdoing. Chris Scott has been very critical of that entire process, but full credit to Tanner Bruin. He's put it behind him, and he's been a very good player in 2026 for the Geelong Football Club. So it's a tough situation for Sydney. Who knows what will happen? I think that there's a good chance that those players will be stood down this week. And if there is found to be a case to answer, like Tanner Bruin, you think that have to be stood down for the rest of the season. And if, as we're hearing, again, it's all speculation at this stage, that they are among some of their better players, that could be their premiership aspirations done and dusted. And as I say, this is a club that generally doesn't put a foot wrong off the field. It has an excellent culture. That culture was, of course, brought in by Paul Roos and Brett Kirk, the culture of the Bloods, and they've led from the front. They've been a very successful team on the field, very stable off the field. But this is a situation that's got out of control. And my question is, why did they go out? And why did they, if there's a case to answer, put themselves in a position for this to derail the chance of redemption and winning a premiership? So that's the big issue. And again, it is unfortunately become the number one issue, an off-field issue. We saw it for the last week or so regarding as I mentioned it earlier, regarding the waiver that Jake Kolajasny, the Geelong defender, signed so he could keep playing despite having a number of concussions. That issue is still, of course, again, as I mentioned, bubbling around in the background, but this issue is taken centre stage now, and it would be a mighty effort by Dean Cox if he's able to keep his team together regarding this. He might just have to. And hopefully, as far as Sydney are concerned, if these players are not playing this week and in the finals, and again, I'm just speculating, you would think if there's a case to answer, that the Sydney Swans, being the club that they say they are going to have to act in a way that a punishment needs to occur, and that would be not playing football. Whether it affects their premiership chances or not, it would certainly make it tough if they're among some of their better players, and whether they've got the replacements to come in. Although, as we've said, Craig McRae's a great believer that one player out, another soldier in. But whether Sydney have got those replacements remains to be seen. But that is a major cause for concern regarding the Sydney Swans. Before we finish on Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures podcast and our View from the Outer podcast, and would love all your comments too on the various social media platforms on what we've spoken about tonight as we head into the final round of the season. I mentioned that there are a number of spots that still need to be signed, sealed and delivered. Fremantle's is not one of those. A good win again from the Dockers against Adelaide. They started tardily again, not as bad as some of the other weeks where they've got off to a very poor start. The Bulldogs earlier in the season in round 8. It was a slow start against Hawthorn, against Geelong. We saw them only kick 11 behinds against the Swans and then played as brutal football as you're ever likely to see, with a huge scoring blitz in the second half to blow Sydney away. They're the best second half team in the comp by a long, long way. They allowed Melbourne to get back into the game last week. They might have learned a bit from that. The concern is it was at the MCG and they couldn't close a game out in the last quarter, which they've been able to do throughout the rest of the season. I thought Adelaide played some pretty good footy on the weekend. But the problem with the Crows is they don't have the talent, or to use the D word that I've used a lot this season, depth that Fremantle has. They've got so much depth. They've got so much talent. They've been clever with the resting of players. Alex Pearce has missed a game. Brennan Cox has missed a game. And they haven't missed a beat in that area because Oscar McDonald, a very solid backup defender, has come in and played some good footy. He played his best game of the season when the Bulldogs tried to flood Fremantle out of the game a few weeks ago in Perth. They were pretty competitive, the Dogs, but Oscar McDonald was one of the reasons why Fremantle won the game, because the Bulldogs couldn't get the ball inside 50, and he repelled forward thrust or attempted forward thrust after attempted forward thrusts. He's a good backup if required. Would you play him or Mason Cox? They think they need a second ruckman. Obviously, they've got Mason Cox in ahead of Sean Darcy at the moment, but they've got all bases covered. And it was another impressive display by Fremantle. They've got Carlton on the weekend. I don't think Justin Longmuir is like Ross Lyon. A couple of times when Fremantle have been in a good position. 2015 was that example. They brought virtually a Peel Thunder team from the Waffle in. With the greatest respect to Peel Thunder, a good football side in the Waffle. They rested a lot of their key players to get ready. It was before the bye had come in. The bye came in 2016 when the Dogs won the premiership. This was 2015. They had a final at home the next week. They managed to win it unimpressively. I think by then the bubble had burst a bit. They dominated the first 2/3 of the season and then sort of had gone off their tucker in the back part of the year and eventually were beaten in a preliminary final by the Hawks 2 weeks later. So I'm not sure Justin Longmuir is like Ross Lyon and he'll rest a lot of players. He might rest a couple this week to get them ready for the finals. But having said that, the top 6, as we know, will have the week off before they start their finals campaign. 7, 8, 9 and 10. And we know that Collingwood, the Bulldogs and Carlton are going to be 3 of those teams will have to play to earn the right to get to an elimination final the next week. And whether the wildcard works, well, the proof will be in the pudding with the crowds. As I said a bit earlier, Carlton and Collingwood, well, that's going to be a massive crowd. 2 of the traditional rivals of the old VFL, still traditional rivals. I still think those 2 clubs, the supporters of those 2 clubs, ask them who they want to beat more than anyone else. They will say, certainly Collingwood will say Carlton. Carlton will say Collingwood, although you may get them hesitating slightly or pausing momentarily, thinking about whether it would be Collingwood or Essendon, who've had a dreadful season, but very soon will name their coach, expected to be Mark McVeigh, which to me is an interesting decision because even though I don't think it should be James Hird, I thought it would be James Hird. And the only reason I thought it was going to be James Hird was it would silence everyone regarding the fact that James Hird is the Messiah, as the saviour, especially those at the Essendon Football Club who to me still live in the past, in the 20th century and the early part of this particular century when Kevin Sheedy was coach. And even though the Bombers had a lot of success under Sheedy, there's been coaches before him and coaches after him that have played in finals but haven't won one. The last coach before Kevin Sheedy to win a final was Jack Clark, and that was the preliminary final in 1968 against Carlton before him was one of the legends. Well, Jack Clark was a legend of the Essendon Football Club as well. But John Coleman, he won 2 flags in 1962 and 1965. So Sheeds was an outstanding success, but I think probably coached for too long. And the Bombers have really struggled since then, as we know, have won a final since 2004 and been pretty poor throughout most of the season. They had a crack against Sydney. Good to see Nate Caddy kick 3 goals. Zach Merritt, who probably play his last game for the Bombers this week, was pretty solid. And it's good to see Zach Reid get some continuity into his body in regard to football. He, of course, was one of those 3 top 10 recruits in the 2020 national draft, which was compromised by COVID. But he's had a lot of injuries in that time, and he hasn't yet played 50 games. He's been on the list for 6 seasons, but he's one that's been fairly solid. He still hasn't played a lot of senior footy, but he's getting better and better as a key defender. And if he can keep staying fit and do what he's done this year, he'll become, I think, a pretty good key defender. And that's why the Bombers were keen on him way back in 2020 to go inside the top 10. But it'll be interesting as to when they name their coach. We know that Carlton will name Josh Fraser tomorrow, and he thoroughly deserves it. I got to know Josh when I worked with him at the ABC. As many people have said, he is a cool and calm customer. He doesn't let outside noise affect him. He may have, even though he had said publicly he wasn't interested in the job, I think that he might have been interested all along, but the interest has obviously gained momentum the longer this successful campaign has gone. I thought when they lost to Hawthorn in the wet and then Collingwood the next week that maybe their endeavours to chase the season after winning just one of their first 9 under Michael Voss, and even though they played some pretty good footy in many of those games, just wasn't the right game plan that Michael Voss was implementing at that stage. I thought once they lost to Hawthorn and Collingwood, the season might fall away, but then they've thrashed Brisbane, they've thrashed St Kilda, drawn with the Western Bulldogs, and they've found their way into a wild card. So he had to get the job, even though we know Corey Enright was a good candidate. Jamie Graham, a little bit unsung, I suppose, a lower profile person because he spent most of his football career, whether it be as a player with West Coast Eagles or coaching with West Coast Eagles and Fremantle. He would have been a good choice too, and I think there'll be an opportunity down the track. He's also made the shortlist at Essendon, Jamie Graham, but as I say, we think it'll go to Mark McVeigh, but we'll certainly watch this space. But the final round this week and some interesting games which will decide where everyone will fit in regard to the top 10 and which teams will finish in that all-important top 6 so they don't have to play the wild card to earn the right to then play an elimination final the next week. Obviously, Adelaide will be looking to have a win over GWS. So they're a reasonable side, the Crows, but I just think their midfield lacks a bit of class. They've got Dawson, they've got Rankin, whose last 2 weeks have been through the roof. They've been magnificent. But the rest of them, to me, are just foot soldiers. Peatling's a solid player. Keys is a solid player. Saligo's been a bit up and down. I'm not sure about Rochelle as a midfielder. Don't know whether he's quite got the tank for that. They need to find more midfielders and more classy midfielders, the Adelaide Crows. That's an issue that's been letting them down. We know they've got the 3 tall forwards. That's worked some of the time. It's certainly worked for the Fremantle Dockers. It hasn't worked all the time for Adelaide with Taylor Walker, who retired at the end of the season, and Fogarty and also Tilthorpe. But the Crows will be looking to beat GWS. They need Melbourne to lose to the Bulldogs. I can't see that happening with Melbourne's Fortress at the MCG. They've dropped 1 game there for the entire season. Their record at the MCG has been magnificent. The Dogs might get a few back. There's talk that Marcus Bontempelli might be given another week off. That might be a good thing, although I heard on 360 tonight, Luke Beveridge was on again for the second time in 3 weeks with Stephen King, the same 2 that were on a couple of weeks ago. And Beveridge said, I think they're keen to have him rest for 1 more week with a little bit of a sore Achilles. But I know Bont will want to play, is what Beveridge has said. And I think we all know as Bulldog supporters that he'll want to play. We're expecting Bailey Dale to come back. Connor Butterick a good chance to come back as well. Tim English won't. So Rory Lobb, a big job against the best ruckman in the comp. He's about to become the first player to win 9 All-Australians in Max Gawn. And what a season he's had. But how good have the Demons been? Stephen King promised they'd play attacking footy, and every player has bought into that. They moved on Christian Petrarca and Clayton Oliver, 2 of their best players over the last 8 or 9 years or so. Oliver had won 4 best and fairest. Petrarca had won a best and fairest. He'd also won a Norm Smith medal, but they haven't missed a beat. Stephen May retires. Been some controversy in that particular space off the field, as we know. Players that have come in, Jack Steele's been superb. Obviously, Mychek getting injured. didn't help their cause, but they've managed to replace him a bit like Collingwood with Craig McRae. Jefferson's come in and is doing a job. They won't have Van Ruin. They're hoping to take that to the tribunal with that incident with Alir, who was concussed. And again, it's the result of the incident, which is probably going to cost Van Ruin 3 weeks, which is what it is at this stage. I think Melbourne will try and argue to get it down to 2. But if it is 3 weeks, he won't be available until the preliminary final if the Demons get there. I'm not sure they're quite going to get there this year. But having said that, should they beat the Bulldogs, they'll get a home elimination final the next week. They could even finish top 4, which means they'll have to travel the first week, but we'll get a semi-final. Results need to go their way. They need Hawthorn to lose to Wildcard, which I think would be highly unlikely, even though, as I say, the Hawks are not in great form. They'll need Collingwood to beat Brisbane. You never rule out the Magpies the way they play. And they'll need Geelong to go down to the Tigers, which I can't see that happening for Melbourne to somehow finish in the top 4. But I think they'll finish top 6 because, as I say, I think they'll be too good for the Dogs, who really got themselves up, even without Marcus Bontempelli, for that good effort against Carlton, where they drew the game. Ed Richards had his absolute best. They missed some shots out there, but they played some pretty good footy and they'll push the Demons, but we know how good Melbourne is at the MCG, and that's why they're going to be dangerous the higher they finish in their quest to get to the Holy Grail, like they did in 2021, knowing how well they play at the MCG. Well, that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed me rabbiting along for the last 50 minutes or so. I will endeavour to have guests back next week. We thank our major sponsor, Claude and Antoinetta and the crew at the Sporto Family Restaurants, where Italy comes alive on a plate, forged from Nonna's Kitchen, made with Southern Soul. Some restaurants feed you, they bring you home. Every dish at the Sporto is a love letter to Southern Italy, artisan crafted from the freshest seasonal produce, built on recipes passed down through generations and serve with the warmth of family around a shared table. Italians live life through their hands, and you'll taste every moment of it, and all their ingredients and produce come from Italy. Whether you're pulling up a chair for dinner, grabbing your favourite pizza on the way home, or gathering the whole crew for something special, the Sporto is where the laid-back charm of Italy's south meets the style of the north, familiar, generous and unforgettable. And you can get them with a restaurant at Williamstown, Yarraville, Essendon, right near Windy Hill, the kiosk at Williamstown Beach, always packed on the weekend in particular, and especially during summer, the queues are miles long. And the Gelato di Sporto, best gelato I've ever tasted in my life. Some magnificent flavours organised by Claude and Antoinetta and their team. And Gelato di Sporto is based at Yarraville, and Bottego di Sporto at Yarraville as well. And, of course, the Yarraville restaurant is right next door to the famous theatre at Yarraville. So, again, we thank di Sporto for jumping on board. If you want to get hold of this podcast and all the other podcasts for Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures, you can go to all the relevant social media platforms. If you want to make a comment about what we've spoken about tonight, feel free to also get on the social media platforms and also on Spotify. We'll catch you again next week, where we'll know where the finals are going to be for certainly the first week and what the top 10 is for the last round of the home and away season. Enjoy your weekend footy. We'll catch you again next week.
Nonna's table to yours tonight. Fresh Italian flavors done just right. Artisan pizza and pasta too, made with amore just for you. The oven's warm, the air smells sweet, a gathering that can't be beat. Pizza the Sporto, take a bite, taste the joy, feel the light. Pizza the Sporto, share the cheer, bringing Italy right here. Hand-tossed dough and sauce so fine, the perfect slice, a taste divine. Family recipes old and true, crafted lovingly for you. The oven's warm, the air smells sweet, a gathering that can't be beat. Pizza the Sport. From Nana's hands to this place, every smile on every face, a tradition we hold dear, making memories year by year. Pizza to Sporto, take a bite, taste the joy